Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that sounds almost too simple to be interesting. What happens when the sun sets earlier each day and the darkness that once lasted 8 hours suddenly stretches to 14? The answer, it turns out, built entire systems of social control, transformed ordinary citizens into reluctant soldiers, and created patterns of community surveillance that echo into the present moment. This is the story of how medieval and early modern communities solved one of civilization's most persistent problems, keeping people safe during the dangerous hours when no one can see what anyone else is doing. The shift happened gradually, like the turn-in of the seasons themselves. In June, a town watchman in 14th century York might begin his patrol at 9 in the evening and finish at 4 in the morning. 7 hours a walk in dark streets, listening for trouble, carrying a lantern that marked him as authority, while simultaneously making him a target. But as autumn crept across the English countryside and December's darkness settled in, that same watchman now faces a patrol that begins at 4 in the afternoon and doesn't end until 8 the next morning. 16 hours. The same man, the same streets, the same responsibility, but more than double the time. How did communities manage this expansion? How did they convince ordinary people to spend their winter nights walking cold streets instead of sleeping by their fires? The answer isn't dramatic proclamations or sudden mandates. It's far more interesting than that. Towns developed stepwise systems, careful, incremental adjustments that added patrol hours in predictable stages, usually corresponding to specific dates on the calendar. These weren't arbitrary decisions. They were sophisticated responses to a mathematical problem that every pre-electric society faced. Darkness is dangerous, and winter brings a lot more of it. Before we continue, let me ask something. If you're the kind of person who finds yourself watching videos about medieval patrol systems at whatever hour it happens to be where you are, you're exactly who I make these for. Take a moment to subscribe if that sounds like you, and tell me in the comments what time it is and whether it's dark outside right now. I'm genuinely curious who joins me for these deep dives into the quiet rules that governed ordinary lives. Now, to understand why winter patrol hours mattered so intensely, you need to understand what darkness meant to medieval people. It wasn't inconvenience, it was transformation. When the sun set, the entire character of a community changed. The same market square that bustled with legitimate commerce during daylight became, after dark, a space of potential violence, theft, and moral transgression. Windows that stood open during the day were shuttered and barred. Doors that welcomed neighbors now featured heavy locks and suspicious eyes peering through small openings. The night belonged to a different category of human activity entirely. Medieval law recognized this fundamental shift. Legal codes across Europe distinguished between crimes committed during daylight and those committed after dark, with nighttime offenses carrying substantially harsher penalties. A theft that might earn you a fine during the day could cost you a hand at night. The logic was straightforward. Anyone conducting business after dark was presumed to be conducting bad business. The night was not a time for honest people to be about, and anyone encountered after curfew was automatically suspect. Curfew itself comes from the French couvre-feu, cover fire. The term originally referred to the practice of banking household fires at night, both for safety and as a signal that the day's legitimate activities had concluded. When the curfew bell rang, you covered your fire, extinguished your candles, and stayed indoors. The streets belonged to the watch now. Anyone found outside without legitimate reason, and that legitimate reason had better be extremely compelling, faced immediate questioning and potential detention. But here's where it gets complicated. The curfew bell rang at a fixed time, typically determined by local custom or ecclesiastical tradition. In many English towns, it rang at 8 or 9 in the evening throughout the year. The problem is obvious. In June, 8 in the evening still has light in the sky. In December, 8 in the evening comes nearly 4 hours after darkness has fallen. The danger period, the hours between sunset and curfew, was essentially non-existent in summer and enormous in winter. Something had to give. Some towns solved this by moving curfew time seasonally. London, for instance, adjusted its curfew bells according to the length of daylight, ringing earlier in winter and later in summer. But even with adjusted curfews, the fundamental problem remained. Winter nights are simply longer than summer nights. A patrol that covers the curfew to dawn period inevitably expands and contracts with the seasons. Towns needed systems to manage this expansion that wouldn't bankrupt their treasuries or exhaust their watchmen to the point of uselessness. The solution that emerged across medieval Europe was remarkably consistent, despite the absence of any central coordination. Towns developed calendrical systems that added patrol hours in discrete steps, usually corresponding to major feast days or astronomical markers. The Feast of All Saints on November 1st might trigger the addition of an extra hour. The Feast of St. Martin on November 11th might add another. The winter solstice or Christmas might represent the maximum expansion, after which hours would gradually be subtracted, following the same stepwise pattern in reverse. Consider the records from Coventry in the 15th century. The town maintained detailed accounts of payments to watchmen, and these payments reveal the stepwise system in action. From Michaelmas in late September through All Hallows in early November, watchmen were paid for 10-hour shifts. From All Hallows through Martinmas, the shifts extended to 12 hours, with corresponding increases in pay. From Martinmas through Candlemas in early February, shifts reached their maximum of 14 hours. Then the pattern reversed, with hours gradually subtracted until the summer schedule of 8-hour watches resumed. This wasn't arbitrary bureaucracy. It was sophisticated workforce management adapted to environmental constraints. The stepwise system allowed towns to budget accurately, knowing exactly when payroll costs would increase and by how much. It gave watchmen predictability. They knew the schedule in advance and could plan their lives accordingly. And it ensured that patrol coverage didn't simply collapse under the weight of winter's extended darkness. Instead of trying to stretch the same resources across impossible expanses, towns acknowledged the changed reality and adjusted their systems to match. The personnel implications were significant. A town that could cover its streets with 6 watchmen during summer nights might need 10 or 12 during the longest winter nights. Where did these additional bodies come from? The answer varied by community, but several patterns dominated. Some towns simply hired more men during winter months, drawing from the pool of laborers who had less agricultural work during the cold season anyway. Others rotated civic obligations, requiring householders to serve periodic watches as part of their duty to the community. Still others combined professional watchmen with conscripted assistants, creating hierarchical patrol units where paid experts supervised unpaid citizens. The rotation system deserves particular attention because it reveals how deeply winter patrol obligations penetrated ordinary life. In many German towns, for instance, the Bürgerwache, or citizen watch, operated alongside professional night watchmen. During summer, these citizen obligations might require service once every several weeks. During winter, the same household might face watch duty every 10 days or even more frequently. The burden of extended winter darkness fell not just on professional watchmen, but on entire communities, redistributing the cost of security across all tax-paying households. This created interesting social dynamics. Wealthy citizens who could afford to hire substitutes did so, paying poorer neighbors to fulfill their watch obligations. This practice was sometimes banned, sometimes tolerated, and sometimes actively encouraged, depending on the town's particular circumstances. In Florence, the practice of hiring substitutes was essentially universal among the merchant class, creating a de facto division between those who served and those who paid. In smaller English market towns, the same practice was often forbidden precisely because it would concentrate the burden on those least able to bear it. The equipment requirements also expanded with winter patrols. Summer watchmen might carry simple lanterns and staffs, sufficient for their shorter shifts. Winter watchmen needed heavier cloaks, better footwear, and often more substantial weapons. The extended exposure to cold required periodic warming, which meant maintaining fire stations at strategic points along patrol routes. These fire stations themselves became nodes in the surveillance network, places where watchmen could warm themselves, but also natural gathering points that required monitoring to prevent unauthorized use. Some towns developed elaborate infrastructure specifically for winter watch operations. York's medieval records describe watch houses positioned at key intersections, small sheltered structures where patrolling watchmen could take turns warming themselves without abandoning their posts entirely. These weren't rest breaks in any comfortable sense. They were strategic rotations designed to prevent watchmen from becoming so cold they couldn't function effectively. The watch houses themselves had rules about maximum occupation time, ensuring that no one simply retreated from the cold and stayed inside. The psychology of winter patrol differed fundamentally from summer patrol. Those additional hours weren't simply more of the same, they were different kinds of hours. The deep night between roughly midnight and 4 in the morning has a quality of stillness that earlier and later hours don't share. During summer, when patrols ended around 4, watchmen rarely experienced this profound quiet. During winter, they lived in it for hours. The human body responds to this environment differently, with decreased alertness and increased susceptibility to hallucination or paranoia. Towns recognized this and developed countermeasures. The most common countermeasure was mandatory call-in. Watchmen were required to call out at regular intervals, both to demonstrate their alertness and to reassure sleeping citizens that the watch was active. The specific calls varied enormously by region and period. Some were simple announcements of the hour. Others were more elaborate, incorporating weather observations, prayers, or warnings about fire danger. The famous Nachtwächter calls, preserved in German folklore, those elaborate sung announcements of the hour, weren't mere tradition. They were operational requirements designed to prove that watchmen remained conscious and functional during the most challenging hours of their shifts. Winter call-in schedules were typically more frequent than summer schedules. A watchman might call every half hour during a summer patrol, but every 15 minutes during winter. This served multiple purposes. It kept the watchman awake through the requirement for regular vocalization. It provided more frequent reassurance to citizens who might lie awake listening for signs that their town remained protected. And it created a distributed alarm system. If a watchman failed to call at the expected time, neighboring watchmen or alert citizens would notice and investigate. The content of winter calls often differed from summer calls as well. Where summer calls might focus primarily on the hour and basic safety, winter calls frequently included warnings about fire. The irony is apparent. In winter, when households relied most heavily on heating fires, the risk of conflagration was highest. Yet citizens couldn't simply stop heating their homes to reduce fire risk. The watchman's calls served as periodic reminders to check fires, bank coals properly, and ensure that the very warmth keeping families alive wasn't about to kill them. Fire watching and crime watching were never really separate functions in medieval patrol systems. The same darkness that concealed thieves also concealed fire's early signs. The same vigilance that spotted suspicious movement also spotted suspicious smoke. Winter patrols, with their extended hours, provided more opportunity to catch fires early, but also required watchmen to spend longer periods in cold that made them less effective at noticing anything. Towns balance these competing pressures through system design rather than relying on individual watchmen's superhuman endurance. The coordination between different patrol units became more complex during winter. Most medieval towns divided their territories into wards or districts, each with its own watch personnel. During summer, when patrols were shorter, coordination between wards might be minimal. Each district handled its own area, and handoffs between shifts were straightforward. During winter, the extended hours required more sophisticated handoff procedures. Watchmen might patrol their own wards for part of the night and then combine with neighboring ward patrols for the deep night hours, creating larger units that could cover more ground while providing mutual supervision. This mutual supervision wasn't accidental. One of the persistent problems with night watch systems was the temptation for watchmen themselves to use the darkness for inappropriate purposes. A watchman alone on an empty street at 3 in the morning faces minimal oversight and maximum opportunity. Historical records are full of watchmen accused of sleeping on duty, drinking on duty, consorting with prostitutes on duty, and engaging in the very theft and violence they were supposed to prevent. The extended winter hours made these temptations more intense and the oversight problem more acute. Towns developed various monitoring mechanisms to ensure watchmen actually patrolled rather than hiding in comfortable corners. Some required watchmen to collect tokens or markers from specific locations, proving they had visited those points during their patrols. Others assigned inspectors to make random checks throughout the night, catching watchmen who had abandoned their routes. Still others relied on citizen complaints, encouraging residents to report watchmen who failed to make expected calls or who weren't visible when they should have been. The stepwise addition of winter hours also affected the supervision hierarchy. Summer night watches might operate with relatively flat structures, a few watchmen of roughly equal status covering a district. Winter watches often required more hierarchical organization, with senior watchmen supervising juniors, shift commanders coordinating multiple districts, and ultimately civic officials maintaining oversight of the entire system. These management layers added to winter costs, but were deemed necessary to maintain discipline during the long, cold nights when the temptation to shirk was strongest. The financial records that survive from medieval and early modern towns tell a story of careful calculation. Town councils debated winter watch budgets with the same intensity they applied to other major expenditures. The stepwise system allowed for precise budgeting. If you knew exactly when hours would be added and by how much, you could calculate seasonal costs in advance. But this precision also created opportunities for conflict. Watchmen who felt their winter compensation was inadequate could point to specific dates when their burden increased, demanding corresponding increases in pay. These negotiations sometimes became contentious. In some towns, winter watch duty was so burdensome that capable watchmen refused to serve unless compensation was substantially increased. This created a quality problem. The men willing to work winter watches for inadequate pay were often not the men you wanted watching your streets. The alternative, paying premium rates for winter service, strained civic budgets and created resentment among taxpayers who felt they were already contributing enough. Every town had to find its own equilibrium between these competing pressures. The religious calendar played a crucial role in how towns structured their stepwise systems. Medieval life was organized around feast days, and these provided natural markers for schedule changes. Using feasts like Michaelmas, Martinmas, and Candlemas to trigger patrol hour adjustments meant that the changes were tied to events that everyone already marked. Watchmen knew that Martinmas meant extended hours, not because they tracked calendars carefully, but because Martinmas was already significant in their lives. The patrol system piggybacked on existing social infrastructure. This connection to the religious calendar also gave the step-stipe system a kind of legitimacy it might otherwise have lacked. The additions weren't arbitrary impositions by civic authority. They were tied to the sacred rhythm of the year. When hours extended around All Saints, the extension was part of the same moment when Christians remembered the dead and prepared for the darker months. When hours contracted around Candlemas, the contraction accompanied the church's celebration of returning light. The patrol schedule became part of the cosmic order rather than mere administrative convenience. The longest night of the year, the winter solstice, held particular significance. In many towns, the solstice night required special arrangements beyond the normal maximum winter schedule. Additional watchmen might be called out, creating a kind of ceremonial maximum patrol that marked the turning point of the year. This wasn't purely practical, it was partly ritual. The solstice patrol represented the community's defiance of maximum darkness, a collective assertion that even on the longest night, the town would remain vigilant. What's remarkable about these systems is their consistency across diverse communities that had no formal communication with each other. Towns in England, France, Germany, and Italy all developed strikingly similar stepwise approaches to winter patrol hours. This consistency suggests that the systems weren't copied from some central model, but rather emerged independently from similar constraints. Any community facing the same environmental and social pressures, extended winter darkness, limited resources, the need to maintain security, would likely arrive at similar solutions. This is what makes the history of winter patrol so fascinating. It's not a story of great innovations or famous inventors. It's a story of countless anonymous civic officials working independently, solving the same problem over and over again. The stepwise system wasn't designed by anyone in particular. It evolved through trial and error across hundreds of communities over hundreds of years. The versions that worked survived and spread through imitation. The versions that failed were modified or abandoned. But the story doesn't end with the medieval period. The stepwise system adapted and persisted into the early modern era, where it encountered new challenges and developed new variations. Gaslighting, professional police forces, and changing conceptions of public and private space all transformed night patrol while preserving certain fundamental structures. The next part of our exploration will trace these transformations, showing how winter curfews and extended patrol hours evolved as the world around them changed. The darkness remained the same length after all, only the human systems for managing it changed. The journey from medieval watchmen to modern policing isn't a simple story of progress. It's a story of different societies making different choices about how to balance security, cost, and liberty during the dangerous hours of darkness. And at each stage, the fundamental problem posed by winter darkness, requiring more vigilance, continued to shape those choices in ways we can still trace today. The fire is burning low, and the night is growing longer. Let's continue. The transformation of winter patrol systems didn't happen in isolation. As medieval towns grew into early modern cities, as populations swelled and commerce expanded, the fundamental challenge of extended winter darkness intersected with new social realities. The stepwise systems that had worked reasonably well for communities of a few thousand people faced entirely different pressures when applied to cities of 50 or 100,000. And yet the basic problem remained identical. Winter nights were longer, and someone had to watch them. By the 16th century, the largest European cities had developed patrol systems of considerable complexity. London's watch system, for instance, employed hundreds of men across dozens of wards, each operating according to schedules that expanded and contracted with the seasons. The stepwise additions that might seem straightforward for a small market town became logistical challenges of the first order when scaled to metropolitan dimensions. Coordinating the shift changes of 300 watchmen across a city of 12 square miles required administrative sophistication that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations. The winter expansion of patrol hours created particular coordination problems at ward boundaries. When each ward operated its own watch, the transition zones between wards became potential weak points, areas where responsibility was ambiguous and where criminals could slip between jurisdictions. During summer, when patrol shifts were shorter and the hours of darkness fewer, these boundary problems were manageable. During winter, when the same boundaries had to be covered for nearly twice as many hours, the gaps became more serious. Cities developed various solutions to this boundary problem. Some created roving patrols specifically tasked with covering ward boundaries, adding another layer of personnel to the winter watch. Others established fixed boundary posts, where watchmen from adjacent wards would meet at scheduled times, providing mutual verification that both patrols were active. Still others simply accepted that ward boundaries would be less well patrolled and focused resources on ward interiors, trusting that the boundary zones were at least somewhat covered by both adjacent patrols. The economic pressures of winter patrol expansion became more acute as cities grew. A town that spent a few pounds per week on its summer watch might spend 5 times that during winter. For small towns, this seasonal variation was manageable. Watch expenses were a relatively minor budget line, and the fluctuations could be absorbed. For large cities, where watch costs might represent a significant percentage of civic expenditure, the winter surge created genuine fiscal strain. Urban governments had to either accumulate reserves during cheaper seasons, raise taxes specifically for winter watch expenses, or find ways to reduce winter costs without compromising security. One common cost reduction strategy was to shift more of the winter burden onto unpaid or lightly compensated citizen service. The watch and ward obligations that required householders to serve periodic patrol duty became more onerous during winter months. In Bristol, during the 15th and 16th centuries, householders who might serve 1 night per month during summer could face service once every 2 weeks during winter. The theory was that spreading the burden widely would make the extended hours more tolerable. Each individual served more often, but no one was crushed by the additional obligation. The practice was considerably messier than the theory. Wealthy householders increasingly found ways to avoid service, whether through official exemptions, hired substitutes, or simple corruption. The burden of winter watch duty fell disproportionately on those least able to afford the lost sleep and the time away from work. A prosperous merchant could pay someone to take his winter watch shifts. A journeyman craftsman could not. The resentment this generated shows up repeatedly in civic records, with petitions complaining about the unfair distribution of watch obligations and demands for reform. The quality of winter watch service was a persistent concern. Even willing participants became less effective as winter hours extended further into the night. The human capacity to remain alert doesn't scale linearly with the length of required vigilance. A watchman who has been on duty for 12 hours is not simply 50% more tired than one who has been on duty for 8 hours. He's substantially less effective at the core tasks of observation and response. Towns knew this, but had limited ability to address it. The fundamental constraint was that darkness lasted as long as it lasted, and someone had to be awake during all of it. Some cities experimented with shift structures designed to manage fatigue. Rather than having the same men patrol from dusk to dawn, they divided the night into shorter segments with different personnel covering each. A winter night might be divided into 3 4-hour watches with completely different crews for each segment. This approach addressed fatigue but created new problems. Shift transitions were themselves moments of vulnerability, and the multiplication of personnel increased costs. The optimal solution depended on local circumstances, and different cities made different choices. The advent of public lighting changed the calculus of winter patrol hours in ways that took decades to fully work out. When cities began installing permanent street lighting, initially oil lamps, later gas, the relationship between darkness and danger was fundamentally altered. The premise of extended winter patrols had been that darkness itself was the enemy, requiring more vigilance simply because there was more of it. If lighting could reduce the effect of darkness, perhaps patrol hours could be reduced as well. This reasoning proved partially but not entirely correct. Early street lighting was neither universal nor reliable. It covered main thoroughfares and left side streets dark. It functioned when lamps were filled and lit, but failed when maintenance lapsed. It created pools of light separated by shadows that criminals could exploit. The presence of lighting changed how patrol routes were designed. Watchmen might now focus on the dark areas, while assuming the lit areas required less attention. But it didn't eliminate the need for winter hour expansion. The longest nights still required the most coverage, even if that coverage was now more strategically targeted. The relationship between lighting and patrol evolved differently in different cities. Based on how lighting was robust and well-maintained, winter patrol schedules eventually contracted somewhat, with the savings redirected to other civic needs. In cities where lighting was sparse or unreliable, the old stepwise winter schedules persisted alongside whatever lighting existed, creating redundant systems that duplicated costs without clearly improving security. If this exploration of how ordinary communities solve the darkness problem resonates with you, if you're feeling that spark of recognition at how practical constraints shape social systems, then you understand exactly why I make these videos. The subscribe button is there if you want more of these moments where history The professionalization of policing in the 18th and 19th centuries brought new perspectives to the winter patrol problem. Professional police forces, unlike citizen watches, were supposed to maintain consistent levels of service regardless of season. The very concept of professional policing implied that public safety shouldn't depend on the willingness of amateur citizens to sacrifice their sleep. But professional forces still faced the same environmental constraint. Winter nights were longer than summer nights, and they had to be covered. The professional solution was primarily institutional rather than temporal. Rather than expanding individual officer hours during winter, professional departments maintained larger permanent forces capable of covering extended darkness through rotation rather than elongation. A police force that could cover summer nights with 4 officers on duty might use 6 during winter, with the total number of man-hours per officer remaining roughly constant across seasons. This approach required maintaining more officers year-round than summer needs alone would justify, an expense that departments defended as necessary for consistent service. The transition from amateur watch to professional police often preserved elements of the stepwise seasonal system, even as it transformed the underlying structure. Many early police departments inherited watch schedules that included seasonal adjustments, and they maintained these adjustments out of habit or because the inherited infrastructure, watch houses, patrol routes, shift schedules, had been designed around them. It took decades of professional policing before the logic of seasonal adjustment was seriously questioned, and in some jurisdictions, vestigial seasonal variations persisted well into the 20th century. The curfew itself, the original mechanism that defined when public presence became suspicious, also evolved during this period. Medieval curfews applied to essentially everyone. After the bell rang, any person on the street was presumptively up to no good. Early modern curfews became more targeted, applying primarily to specific categories of people: servants, apprentices, strangers, or those without visible means of support. The respectable classes gained increasing freedom to move after dark, while the disreputable classes faced continuing restrictions. This differentiation complicated winter patrol functions. Watchmen who had once simply challenged anyone found outdoors now had to make judgments about who belonged on the streets and who didn't. A prosperous merchant walking home from a late dinner might pass unchallenged. A laborer walking the same route at the same hour might be stopped and questioned. The extended winter hours meant more opportunities for these encounters, more chances for both legitimate security functions and discriminatory harassment. The patrol system became not just a mechanism for detecting crime, but a mechanism for enforcing social boundaries. The winter expansion of patrol hours intersected with concerns about vagrancy in particularly complex ways. Winter was when vagrancy was most dangerous. The combination of cold and homelessness could be lethal, but also when vagrancy was most visible. People without stable housing had to find warmth somehow, and this often meant seeking out fires, crowds, or enclosed spaces where they might not be welcome. Extended patrol hours meant more encounters with the desperate poor, and the responses to these encounters reveal a great deal about prevailing attitudes toward poverty and public order. Some cities treated winter vagrancy as a humanitarian problem requiring humanitarian responses. Their patrols were instructed to direct homeless individuals to shelters, churches, or other warm refuges rather than simply arresting them for being poor. Other cities treated winter vagrancy as a security problem requiring security responses. Their patrols were instructed to remove homeless individuals from public spaces, using arrest if necessary, regardless of where those individuals would go after release. The longer winter nights meant more hours for either approach, with corresponding effects on both the watched and the watchers. The psychological burden on winter patrol officers was substantial and often unacknowledged. Modern research on shift work has documented the health effects of regular nighttime labor: disrupted sleep patterns, increased rates of depression, higher incidence of cardiovascular disease. Historical patrol officers experienced these effects without understanding their causes and without any framework for addressing them. The extended winter hours made everything worse. A watchman who spent 4 months of each year working 14-hour night shifts was unlikely to maintain good health for long. Historical records occasionally reveal the human cost of winter patrol duty. Court cases involving watchmen sometimes mention their physical condition, exhaustion, illness, injuries sustained while half asleep on duty. Requests for relief from watch service frequently cite health reasons, with winter duty specifically mentioned as particularly harmful. Towns occasionally acknowledge these burdens with modest compensation increases or reduced service requirements for elderly or infirm watchmen. But the fundamental expectation remained. Someone had to watch the winter nights, regardless of the cost to their bodies. The social status of watchmen shifted over time in ways that affected how winter patrol duty was perceived and performed. In early medieval periods, watch service was often a respected civic obligation performed by householders of middling status as part of their contribution to community welfare. As towns grew and watch service became more specialized, it increasingly fell to lower status individuals who had few other options. By the early modern period, watchmen had become something close to an insult in many languages, implying someone too old, too slow, or too dim for more productive work. This status decline affected the quality of winter patrol service in predictable ways. Men who took watch positions because they had no better alternatives were not ideal candidates for demanding duty. The extended winter hours exacerbated this problem. The most challenging shifts were performed by the least capable personnel. Towns that wanted better winter security had to either pay more to attract better candidates or accept that their winter patrols would be of lower quality than their summer patrols. Neither option was appealing, and both were tried at various times. The relationship between winter patrol systems and emerging police professionalism was particularly complex in colonial contexts. European colonial powers exported their patrol concepts to territories with entirely different seasonal patterns. A stepwise system designed for English winters made little sense in tropical colonies, where night length varied minimally across the year, or in Southern Hemisphere colonies where summer and winter were reversed. Colonial police forces often maintained metropolitan structures ill-suited to local conditions, creating inefficiencies that took generations to address. The inverse pattern also appeared. Colonial experiences sometimes influenced metropolitan practice. British officials who had served in India, for instance, brought back concepts of patrol organization that affected how British cities thought about their own night watch systems. The exchange wasn't simple or direct, but it was real. Winter patrol systems in 19th century British cities reflected not just medieval inheritance, but also colonial innovation, creating hybrid practices that combined elements from vastly different contexts. The industrialization of production affected winter patrol requirements in ways that contemporaries often failed to anticipate. Pre-industrial towns essentially shut down after dark. There was little productive activity that could occur without daylight. Industrial factories, however, could operate around the clock if adequately lit and staffed. This created new categories of legitimate nighttime activity that challenged traditional patrol assumptions. A worker leaving a factory at 3 in the morning was not suspicious in the way that someone walking streets at 3 in the morning had historically been suspicious. The accommodation of industrial night work into patrol practice happened unevenly. Some factory owners provided their own security, reducing demands on public patrol resources. Others expected public patrols to protect their operations, arguing that factories contributed tax revenue and deserved protection in return. The extended hours of winter darkness meant more hours when factories operated outside of any daylight, more hours when workers traveled dark streets between home and workplace, more hours when valuable goods were vulnerable to theft. The patrol systems that had evolved to manage agricultural communities faced entirely new demands from industrial ones. The documentation that survives from this period reveals intense debates about how to adapt inherited systems to new circumstances. City council records show arguments about whether factory districts required the same stepwise winter patrol expansion as residential areas, or whether the constant activity of industrial operations provided sufficient natural surveillance. Police reports discuss the different challenges posed by industrial night work versus residential sleep, noting that crimes in factory districts follow different patterns than crimes elsewhere. The technology at timekeeping also mattered in ways that aren't immediately obvious. Medieval stepwise systems relied on relatively imprecise time measurement. Feast days provided calendar markers, but hours within a day were approximate. The spread of accurate clocks allowed for much more precise shift scheduling, enabling the optimization of patrol coverage in ways that earlier systems couldn't achieve. Winter patrol shifts could be calibrated to the minute rather than the hour, with handoffs timed to minimize coverage gaps. This precision had costs as well as benefits. Imprecise systems had built-in flexibility. Watchmen who arrived a few minutes early or late caused no particular problems. Precise systems created new opportunities for failure. If your relief doesn't arrive exactly on time, do you abandon your post or stay indefinitely? The management of shift transitions became more bureaucratic, with detailed protocols for handling delays, absences, and emergencies. The extended winter hours meant more shift transitions per night, multiplying the opportunities for procedural failure. The communications technology of the period also transformed winter patrol practice. For most of history, watchmen had operated in isolation, able to summon assistance only through shouting or running to find help. The development of watchboxes with speaking tubes and later a telegraph and telephone connections allowed for coordinated responses that earlier patrols couldn't achieve. A watchman who spotted trouble could notify a central station, which could dispatch additional resources. This coordination capacity was particularly valuable during winter's extended hours, when isolated watchmen were most vulnerable to fatigue and assault. But the communications infrastructure itself required maintenance during winter conditions. Speaking tubes could freeze. Telegraph wires could snap under ice loads. The very systems that promised better winter patrol coordination were themselves vulnerable to winter damage. Cities learned to build redundancy into their communications, maintaining multiple channels so that the failure of one didn't leave watchmen completely isolated. This redundancy added to winter costs, but was deemed necessary for effective operation. The relationship between winter patrol systems and fire protection remained intimate throughout this period. Fire was the great fear of pre-modern cities. A single blaze could destroy entire districts, killing hundreds and leaving thousands homeless. Winter, with its combination of extensive heating fires and extended darkness, was the most dangerous season for fire. Patrol systems that separated fire watching from crime watching risked creating gaps in coverage. Systems that combined both functions risked spreading patrol resources too thin across too many objectives. Different cities made different choices about how to organize fire and crime patrol during winter. Some maintained separate forces, with fire watches focused specifically on conflagration risk and night watches focused on crime. Others combined functions, expecting the same personnel to watch for both fire and felony. Still others created hierarchical systems, where crime patrols reported fire sightings to specialized fire response units. The extended hours of winter meant that whatever organizational choice a city made, it would be tested most severely during the coldest, darkest months. The statistical records that began to be kept during this period allow us to measure, imperfectly, the effectiveness of winter patrol expansion. Crime rates in many cities showed seasonal patterns, with winter months often having higher rates of certain offenses, particularly property crimes like burglary. Whether this reflected more criminal opportunity during longer nights, more detection due to extended patrols, or simply better record keeping during winter months, the records themselves shaped how authorities thought about their patrol systems. The interpretation of these statistics became a matter of considerable debate. Advocates for winter patrol expansion pointed to the higher crime rates during winter months as evidence that more patrol hours were needed. Critics pointed to the same data as evidence that extended patrols weren't actually deterring crime. Both interpretations assumed that the statistics accurately reflected underlying reality, which they often didn't. A city that expanded its winter patrols might see an increase in reported crimes simply because more watchmen were present to observe and report them, creating an apparent crime wave that was actually a detection wave. The citizens who lived with winter patrol systems developed their own relationships with watchmen that often differed from official expectations. Official rhetoric portrayed patrols as servants of the public, protecting honest citizens from criminal elements. Actual citizen experience was more complicated. Watchmen who challenged respectable individuals too aggressively drew complaints. Watchmen who let suspicious characters pass unchallenged drew different complaints. The extended hours of winter increased the opportunities for these interactions to go poorly, generating friction between patrols and the populations they supposedly served. Some citizens developed working relationships with regular patrol officers, recognizing familiar faces and establishing mutual understanding about who belonged where. This familiarity could make winter patrols more effective. Watchmen who knew their territories intimately could spot anomalies that strangers would miss. But familiarity could also create problems, as watchmen became reluctant to challenge people they knew, or corrupt relationships developed between patrols and the populations they were supposed to monitor. The evolution of winter patrol systems through the early modern period reflects broader changes in how societies thought about public order and state responsibility. Medieval systems had relied heavily on community self-policing, with watch obligations distributed among householders who protected their own neighborhoods. Early modern systems increasingly professionalized these functions, creating specialized personnel responsible for security. The stepwise expansion of winter hours persisted across this transition, adapted rather than abandoned because the underlying environmental constraint remained unchanged. What does change eventually is the expectation that ordinary citizens will tolerate extended winter surveillance as the price of safety. Modern societies have generally concluded that the burden of winter security should fall on professional forces rather than conscripted amateurs, even if this means higher costs and less comprehensive coverage. The stepwise systems that governed medieval winter nights have largely disappeared from contemporary practice, replaced by year-round professional services that maintain roughly constant presence regardless of season. But the fundamental problem hasn't gone away. Modern cities still experience more crime during winter months, still struggle to staff night shift adequately, still face the tension between security and cost that their predecessors faced. The solutions are different: electric lighting, professional police, sophisticated communications, but the constraint is identical. Winter nights are still longer than summer nights, and they still require watching. The final part of our story will trace how these systems ultimately resolved, examining the technological and social changes that finally ended the era of stepwise seasonal patrol. The transition wasn't smooth, and in some ways it's still ongoing. The darkness continues to pose its ancient challenge, and we continue to answer it with the imperfect tools at our disposal. That's where we're headed next. The end of the Stepwise winter patrol system came not with a dramatic abolition, but with a gradual forgetting. As electric lighting spread through cities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as professional police forces consolidated their authority, as the very concept of curfew became alien to liberal societies, the seasonal adjustments that had structured night patrol for centuries simply faded from practice. The last formal stepwise systems disappeared quietly, their calendrical triggers no longer observed, their feast day markers no longer relevant to organizations that operated on civil calendars and budget cycles. The transition happened at different speeds in different places. London's Metropolitan Police, established in 1829, maintained some seasonal variation in patrol scheduling for decades, gradually standardizing toward year-round practices only in the latter half of the 19th century. Smaller English towns, less professionalized and more tradition-bound, sometimes maintained vestigial stepwise systems into the 20th century, adjusting schedules by local custom even when the formal rationale for adjustment had been forgotten. The pattern was similar across Europe. Larger cities modernized faster, smaller communities held on to older practices longer. The role of electric lighting in this transformation can't be overstated. When gas lighting appeared in the early 19th century, it had altered patrol practice, but hadn't eliminated the underlying logic of seasonal adjustment. Gas lights were expensive to install and maintain, limited in their reach, and unreliable in their operation. They supplemented darkness, but didn't conquer it. Electric lighting was different. It was brighter, cheaper to operate, more reliable, and capable of illuminating spaces that gas could never reach. Streets that had been dark since human settlement was established could now be lit throughout the night, every night, regardless of season. The conquest of darkness by electric light happened in stages. Main thoroughfares first, then secondary streets, then residential areas, then finally the alleys and courtyards that had always been refuges for those who preferred to operate unseen. Each expansion of lighting reduced the territory available to darkness, shrinking the spaces where extended winter patrols had been most necessary. By the mid-20th century, most urban areas in developed countries were lit sufficiently that the distinction between summer and winter darkness, while still real, was no longer the security emergency it had once been. But light alone didn't end the stepwise system. What light did was create the conditions under which other changes could occur. A society that had conquered darkness through technology could afford to think differently about night patrol than a society that experienced darkness as an inevitable seasonal invasion. The psychological shift was as important as the technological one. Darkness was no longer an enemy to be endured, but a condition to be managed. The extended vigilance of winter patrols seemed less necessary when darkness itself seemed less threatening. The professionalization of police forces contributed to the end of stepwise systems by creating year-round institutions with year-round staffing requirements. Medieval and early modern watch systems had been seasonal by nature, with personnel levels fluctuating according to seasonal demand. Professional police forces operated on different logic. They maintained permanent staff who needed to be employed year-round, who expected regular schedules and predictable duties, who resisted the kind of dramatic seasonal variation that stepwise systems imposed. The institutional interests of professional police aligned against seasonal adjustment. This institutional pressure was reinforced by labor organizing among police officers. As police forces professionalized, their members increasingly demanded the kinds of protections that other workers were gaining: regular hours, predictable schedules, overtime pay for additional work. The stepwise expansion of winter hours fit poorly with these expectations. Officers who worked 14-hour shifts during winter while summer colleagues worked 8 hours were obviously bearing an unfair burden. Labor pressure pushed toward standardization, either by reducing winter hours or by increasing summer hours to match. The solution that emerged in most jurisdictions was a compromise: year-round shifts of roughly equal length, with seasonal variation in deployment patterns rather than in individual officer hours. A police department might concentrate more officers on night shifts during winter months, reducing daytime coverage to staff extended nighttime needs, without requiring any individual officer to work dramatically longer hours during any season. This approach preserved the logic of seasonal adjustment. Winter nights still required more coverage, while eliminating the direct burden on individual patrol officers. The communications revolution of the 20th century further reduced the need for extended winter patrol. When watchmen operated in isolation, unable to summon help except through physical movement, the extension of patrol hours meant the extension of vulnerability. A single watchman, alone on a cold winter street at 3 a.m, was genuinely at risk. The development of radio communications changed this calculus entirely. An officer with a radio could summon immediate assistance. The isolation that had made extended hours so dangerous was eliminated. Fewer officers could provide equivalent coverage because each officer could draw on the resources of the entire force. The automobile amplified this effect. Foot patrol, the only option for medieval watchmen and the dominant practice into the early 20th century, was inherently limited by human walking speed. A single officer could cover only so much territory in an hour, and extending the hours of patrol extended the territory covered only linearly. Motor patrol was different. A single officer in a car could cover vastly more territory than a walk-in officer and could respond to calls from much greater distances. The extended hours of winter darkness were less daunting when each patrol unit could survey far more ground. These technological changes didn't eliminate the seasonal pattern of crime. They eliminated the need for seasonal patterns of patrol. Studies from the mid-20th century onward consistently showed that property crimes remained higher during winter months, just as they had been for centuries. The longer nights still provided more cover for burglary and theft, but police departments no longer needed to double their patrol hours to address this seasonal variation. They could adjust deployment within roughly constant total resources, concentrating coverage during the highest risk periods without imposing the kind of dramatic seasonal burden that stepwise systems had required. The decline of curfew as a social institution paralleled and reinforced the decline of stepwise patrol. Medieval curfews had applied broadly, restricting everyone's movement after dark. Early modern curfews had become more targeted, applying primarily to specific categories of people. By the 20th century, general curfews had largely disappeared from liberal democracies, persisting only in emergency situations like wartime or civil unrest. Without curfews to define when legitimate presence on the streets ended and suspicious presence began, the patrol function itself changed. Officers were no longer primarily looking for curfew violators. They were looking for evidence of actual criminal activity. This shift in patrol function affected how seasonal variation was perceived. When patrols existed primarily to enforce curfew, extended winter hours meant extended hours of potential curfew violation. The longer the night, the more time for people to be where they shouldn't be. When patrols existed primarily to deter and detect crime, the relationship between darkness and danger became more nuanced. Yes, longer nights provided more opportunity for crime, but they also provided more opportunity for detection, as alert patrols had more time to notice suspicious activity. The simple equation, more darkness requires more watching, became more complex. The changing urban landscape also mattered. Medieval cities were dense, confined spaces where darkness concentrated danger in predictable ways. Modern cities sprawled across vast territories where the relationship between darkness and danger varied enormously by neighborhood. A residential suburb might be essentially safe throughout the night. An entertainment district might be dangerous at all hours. An industrial zone might be deserted and vulnerable regardless of lighting. The one-size-fits-all approach of stepwise seasonal adjustment was poorly suited to these differentiated urban environments. Contemporary policing has largely abandoned seasonal adjustment in favor of data-driven deployment that responds to actual crime patterns rather than assumed seasonal risks. Departments analyze crime statistics continuously, shifting resources to match observed patterns regardless of whether those patterns follow seasonal expectations. A city that experiences a crime spike in summer, perhaps due to increased outdoor activity or tourist presence, will shift resources accordingly, just as it would for a winter spike. The calendar has ceased to be the primary determinant of patrol scheduling. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. If this story about how ordinary communities solved the problem of winter darkness, how they developed systems that feel strangely modern despite their medieval origins, has changed how you think about security and surveillance, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe and share your thoughts. What surprised you most? What connections do you see to contemporary practices? What does it mean that we've largely forgotten systems that governed ordinary life for centuries? I read every single comment, and I'm genuinely curious what resonates. The legacy of stepwise winter patrol systems survives in unexpected places. Some municipal codes still contain provisions for seasonal variation in city services, even if those provisions are no longer enforced. Some labor contracts for security personnel include references to extended winter hours, vestiges of negotiations from earlier eras. Some rural communities, particularly in northern regions where darkness remains dramatic and resources remain limited, continue to adjust volunteer patrol coverage according to seasonal logic. The systems aren't entirely gone, they've retreated to the margins. The historical memory of winter patrol has also been flattened in ways that obscure its complexity. Popular culture depicts night watchmen as quaint figures, calling the hours, ignoring the sophisticated administrative systems that determined when those hours occurred and how many of them needed to be called. The stepwise adjustments that required careful calibration and periodic negotiation have been reduced to a simple image of a man with a lantern. The reality was far more interesting. These were serious administrative challenges addressed through serious administrative solutions. What the history of Winter Patrol reveals, ultimately, is how environmental constraints shape social systems in ways that persist long after the original constraints have been addressed. The stepwise systems that medieval towns developed to manage winter darkness were rational responses to real problems. They evolved through practical experience, spreading because they worked, and adapting because conditions changed. They created institutional frameworks that outlasted their original purposes, influencing how later generations thought about patrol and surveillance, even as the specific seasonal mechanisms became obsolete. The parallel to contemporary challenges is hard to miss. We too face environmental constraints that shape our social systems, climate change being the most obvious example. We too develop stepwise responses, adjusting our practices incrementally as conditions change. We too create institutions that may outlast their original purposes, binding future generations to choices made under different circumstances. The lesson of winter patrol isn't that we should return to medieval practices. It's that we should recognize how deeply environmental conditions shape social possibility. The darkness hasn't gone away. Even in the most brilliantly lit modern city, winter nights remain longer than summer nights. The human circadian rhythm continues to respond to seasonal light variation, affecting mood and behavior in ways that show up in crime statistics, mental health data, and economic indicators. We've layered technology over the ancient darkness, but we haven't eliminated it. The stepwise systems of the past were answers to questions we've stopped asking, but the questions themselves remain relevant. Consider how contemporary society handles the modern equivalent of the winter patrol problem, the staffing of 24-hour services in general. Hospitals, power plants, emergency services, and countless other operations must be staffed around the clock, every day of the year. The seasonal variation in darkness no longer drives these staffing decisions, but the fundamental challenge of maintaining vigilance during hours when human alertness naturally declines remains identical. We've substituted shift rotation for seasonal expansion, but we're solving the same basic problem. The administrative techniques that medieval towns developed for managing seasonal variation in patrol, the calendrical triggers, the stepwise additions, the graduated pay scales, reappear in modern contexts under different names. Seasonal hiring in retail follows similar logic to seasonal expansion of watch personnel. Tourism industry staffing responds to calendrical patterns in ways that medieval civic officials would recognize. The specific feast days have changed, but the underlying approach of tying staffing to predictable calendar markers persists. The social tensions that stepwise systems created also have modern parallels. Medieval citizens resented unequal watch burdens. Modern workers resent unequal shift assignments. Medieval towns struggled to recruit qualified watchmen for winter duty. Modern employers struggle to staff night shift adequately. Medieval societies debated how to balance security costs against other civic needs. Modern societies debate the same questions in different vocabulary. The context changes, but the underlying tensions remain remarkably stable. The fire-watching function that was so central to medieval winter patrol has evolved into modern emergency management. Contemporary fire departments don't expand their hours seasonally in the way that medieval fire watches did, but they do adjust their preparedness based on seasonal risk factors. Wildfire season in California requires different resources than winter months. Heating fire risks in winter require different public education than summer risks. The specific mechanisms of seasonal adjustment have changed, but the principle of matching resources to seasonally varying risks continues. The psychological dimensions of winter patrol have also found modern expression in our understanding of shift work and seasonal affective disorder. Medieval watchmen suffered from what we would now recognize as the health effects of chronic sleep disruption and insufficient light exposure. Modern research has documented these effects precisely, leading to interventions, light therapy, shift rotation protocols, workplace accommodations that medieval societies couldn't have imagined. But the underlying human biology that made winter patrol so burdensome hasn't changed. We've gotten better at mitigating the effects without eliminating the underlying vulnerability. The surveillance dimensions of winter patrol have expanded dramatically in the modern era. Medieval watchmen observed public spaces with their own eyes. Modern surveillance systems observe far more extensive territories through electronic means. The extension of surveillance coverage during winter hours that once required more human bodies now requires only more camera feeds. The principle of seasonal risk adjustment has been absorbed into automated systems that respond to threat levels rather than calendar dates. But the underlying logic of concentrating surveillance resources during higher risk periods persists. The privacy implications that medieval citizens experienced, the knowledge that their nighttime activities might be observed by passing watchmen, have been enormously amplified by modern technology. A medieval person confronted with the surveillance capabilities of a modern city would be astounded, perhaps horrified. But the basic trade-off between security and privacy that Stepwise patrol systems embodied remains central to contemporary debates. How much surveillance is too much? Who decides? What oversight exists? These questions were asked about medieval watchmen, and they're asked about modern monitoring systems with considerably higher stakes. The community involvement in night patrol that characterized medieval systems has largely disappeared in favor of professional services. This represents a significant shift in how societies think about collective responsibility for security. Medieval watch obligations distributed both the burden and the benefit of night patrol across the community. Everyone served, and everyone was protected by their neighbor's service. Professional policing concentrates the burden on a specialized workforce while distributing the benefit, theoretically, across the entire population. Whether this represents progress depends on what values you prioritize. Some contemporary movements have sought to revive elements of community patrol, often in contexts where professional police are seen as inadequate or hostile. Neighborhood watch programs, community patrol organizations, and similar initiatives echo medieval practices in their reliance on local knowledge and community involvement. These modern versions rarely include the seasonal expansion that characterized historical systems. They operate year-round with roughly constant personnel, but they do revive the principle that security is a community responsibility rather than a state monopoly. The international variation in how societies handle night security also echoes historical patterns. Just as medieval towns developed different approaches to winter patrol based on local conditions, contemporary societies show enormous variation in how they staff and deploy night security resources. Japanese cities, with their extraordinarily low crime rates, require far less night patrol presence than American cities with higher crime rates. Scandinavian cities, with their dramatic seasonal light variation, might be expected to maintain more seasonal adjustment than cities nearer the equator, though modern technology has largely eliminated this distinction. The gender dimensions in night patrol have shifted dramatically. Medieval watch systems were almost exclusively male. Women were expected to be safely indoors after dark, and the patrol function was understood as a masculine responsibility. Modern police forces, while still majority male, include women in patrol roles at all hours. The assumption that darkness requires specifically masculine protection has been partially dismantled, though debates about women in policing continue and often invoke safety concerns related to night work. The class dimensions have shifted as well, though not entirely disappeared. Medieval watch burdens have shifted disproportionately on those unable to pay substitutes or secure exemptions. Modern policing labor comes disproportionately from working-class backgrounds, though for different reasons. The seasonal exploitation of medieval watch duty, compelling extra labor from the least powerful members of society, has been replaced by the structural exploitation of night shift labor, which similarly falls on those with fewer alternatives. What does it mean to understand this history? Perhaps it means recognizing that the challenges we face managing night security aren't new. Perhaps it means appreciating the ingenuity of past solutions while acknowledging their limitations. Perhaps it means seeing our own systems more clearly by understanding how they evolved from earlier practices. The Stepwise Winter Patrol was one answer to an eternal question. How do we keep each other safe when we cannot see? The darkness returns every evening, longer in winter, shorter in summer, as it has since humans first gathered in communities. The systems we've built to manage it are different from those our ancestors built, but they serve the same purpose. We still post guards, literally or electronically. We still light our streets, more brilliantly than any medieval citizen could imagine. We still worry about what happens in the shadows, even as we've reduced the shadows dramatically. The watchmen who walked medieval streets through long winter nights are long dead, their names mostly forgotten, their individual shifts blurred into statistical aggregates and surviving records. But the problem they addressed persists, and the solutions they developed, the stepwise expansions, the calendrical triggers, the graduated responses to environmental constraint inform our own practices in ways we rarely acknowledge. They were ordinary people doing difficult work, solving practical problems with the tools available to them. The fire has burned down to coals, and the longest night eventually ends. The stepwise systems that stretched patrol hours through winter darkness have given way to new approaches. But the underlying challenge remains. We still watch, we still guard, we still try to make it through the dangerous hours until the sun returns. Some problems are permanent. And with that, the night story concludes. The darkness outside your window, whatever season it happens to be, connects you to every generation that ever kept watch against it. The systems change, the darkness doesn't. Thank you for spending these hours with me, exploring how ordinary communities solved extraordinary problems. Until next time, stay warm, stay safe, and keep watching.